see, Christians have always made a radical claim, and it's this, that our search for self-understanding can only be conducted by a heart that has God understanding. Well, hey, welcome to episode 2 of the Kingdom Christians podcast. I'm really glad to have you back. I'm excited to start unpacking some of what we were talking about last week. So last week we were talking about this reality that there's something more. God wants something more for us as Christians. He wants something more for us as believers. And I started talking about this whole idea of kingdom Christians. And when I think about kingdom Christians, at the heart of it is this idea that we pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. How does God end up doing that? I believe God ends up doing that by bringing his will to earth through our lives. And this week I want to talk about that a little bit because I think that the call to become kingdom Christians is something that's good for us and that actually meets one of the deep longings that is alive in our culture here and now today. I think that if we want to reach the world around us, we have to look for points of connection between us and the world. And very often what's going to happen is we're going to find that there are these questions that the world is asking, these longings that they have, but then they're turning to false modes of satisfaction, or they're turning to false answers. Biblically speaking, we're saying they turn to idols, right? Idols and false philosophies, and these become strongholds in their lives. And so it leads to a life that doesn't have the meaning and purpose that they want, right? One of the simple ways I've always put it is that what we have to do is help people see that their deepest intuitions are at odds with their stated convictions. In other words, they have this sense of what life is supposed to be about, right? But then they believe these things and they say these things that in the end, they won't give them what they want. So becoming a kingdom Christian, I believe, is first and foremost about an encounter with God and coming into his presence and experiencing the reality of who he is. And as we do that, we become more fully ourselves. And so I think that there's something about this, reclaiming this understanding of the Christian life as an experience, as an encounter with God. I believe that the more we can press into this, the more we're going to be answering what I think is one of the central questions of our age. And it really comes down to a crisis of self-understanding. We live in an era when the idea of the answer to the question, who am I, is something that's a puzzle that many people are searching for. They're trying to figure out. And some of the reason is because we've gone through a century of dislocation. We've gone through a century where a lot of the answers that used to be norms, right, for culture, those answers have been thrown out the window. This idea that we can tell you like it, boom, 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 boom. If you want to know the meaning of life, it's this, 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 and this. People they doubt that now. There's so many reasons for that. Some of the reason is because, we have this philosophy of Darwinism come along and we find out that humanity is just another animal. We don't have some divine human spark that God has imprinted on us, right? So as a culture, even those who don't believe in that idea, they do believe in God, they're still surrounded by this culture that really has stopped valuing human being, the human person. We can look and we can point to other things. The nature of what family is has been radically redefined over the last century. The idea of gender itself, I mean, in a lot of circles, the very idea of gender has become indefinable. Think about it. This fall, if the schools start up again after this whole coronavirus thing, this fall, there are going to be kindergarten kids going to class, little boys and little girls who are being told that you might have a boy's body, but you might not really be a boy. Now, I'm not trying to get into those different topics. I'm just saying, what do they all have in common? What all of them have in common is this idea that things that used to be sort of taken for granted no longer can be. The modern era has eroded the very idea that there's anything like human nature, that there's a way of being that we all hold in common. I think in the end, the movement of the 20th century coming into the 21st century has dissolved the anchor points of identity, and it's left many people adrift. The self-help movement is the result of that. The self-help movement has come in and it's trying to fill the gap. And along with that, we have the whole self-esteem emphasis, right? Everybody gets a gold star. And so for the last 20, 30 years, there's been this rising kind of like the way to fill that gap of awareness of who you really are is just by telling you how amazing you really are, or by giving you this newest kind of discovery of some ancient wisdom. And if you can just link into this, you're going to figure out the secret of who you are and be able to live the life you want to live. And what's ironic about this is that with that and with the whole self-esteem movement, you're good enough, you're smart enough, doggone it, people like you, right? The irony of all of this is that narcissism like this, that in the midst of all of this, we have a narcissism of generations, and ironically, the narcissism exists without any true sense of security. Take a look around. So many people, they simultaneously celebrate themselves daily on social media, and yet they exist with an identity that's so fragile and so delicate that just one wrong word can shatter their composure. Am I right? I think if you look at the world, this is what you're seeing. And it's rooted in this deep desire to understand who we are and what we're all about. I think when I look at the Christian world, sometimes I think there's a lot of Christians and a lot of Christian voices who are responding to this hunger for understanding, self-understanding. They're responding to it the wrong way. They're writing off the search for self-understanding. They're writing off the search for self-awareness. They treat the hunger for identity as if it's somehow prideful curiosity. They want to tell you, like, the real answer is just to stop thinking about yourself and come and to understand the sovereign God of the universe, who's much more than the puny ants on earth, and you need to understand that you're just a worm. I mean, I hear guys who glory in that kind of a thing, and they love to rail against the culture of seeking, right, in that way. I mean, of course, God is great. God is transcendent. God is truly incomprehensible. But the answer and solution to our society's hunger for self-understanding is not to deny the legitimacy of the hunger. It's like, you have a person who's adrift at sea on a lifeboat and finally gets to that point of drinking seawater. Right? He doesn't need someone to come up to him and say, "Yeah, you're not really thirsty." What that person needs is for someone to give him water that's actually drinkable, water that actually can sustain life. And our solution for a society that's in the midst of an existential struggle with the very idea of what it means to be a person, what it means to find yourself, our solution needs to be to help people encounter the real, authentic version instead of a counterfeit one being sold like snake oil in our self-obsessed culture. And I think there's a reason for that. Christianity's always given an answer to this search for self, because while the search has taken on whole new tones in our day, it's not new itself. It's always been there, and it's always been difficult. You can go back to the earliest philosophers of the Greeks, right? In fact, if you had gone in ancient Greece to the ancient temple of Delphi, you would have seen inscribed above the gateway of that sort of paragon of philosophy these Greek words, "Gnothi seauton," which means know thyself. Benjamin Franklin, in his Poor Richard's Almanac, I love this quote. He said, it's so pithy. He said, there are three things extremely hard: steal, a diamond, and to know oneself. For 30 years, actually now more than 30 years of my life, I've been reading philosophers and poets and storytellers, and I've learned something. that most people are striving to find themselves. They're striving to find the purpose of their lives. And most people have no idea how to go about getting it. Early in my marriage, my wife and I, we went on a trip down south, and we were in Tennessee, and we were led with a group of people into an experience going into these deep, dark caves. And we kept going further and further down into the caves. Everybody's wearing headlamps, you're wearing sweatshirts, you got helmets on and boots, and you're slithering through some of these tunnels. And we finally came to this room, and the guy we were with, he said, turn your lights up. And the room was like a great cathedral. It was so beautiful. And then he had us all sit down, and he had us all turn off our headlamps. And we got to experience absolute darkness. And it was amazing because that room that on one hand was so great and large, it felt oppressive and small. And many times since that experience, I've thought, I can't imagine trying to find my way back out of that cave without a light. Well, listen, here's the deal. The best, most intelligent, most brilliant person in the world, the most incredible philosopher, the most insightful psychologist, the most sensitive artist, can only approach the search for authentic self like a blind man trying to make his way out of a cave if he doesn't start with the most important thing. You see, Christians have always made a radical claim, and it's this, that our search for self-understanding can only be conducted by a heart that has God understanding. I love this quote from John Calvin. He used this to open his magnum opus called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. He said, "Without knowledge of self, there is no knowledge of God. Our wisdom, insofar as it ought to be deemed true and solid wisdom, consists in almost entirely of two parts." In other words, the secret to life, the secret to it all comes to two parts: knowledge of God and knowledge of ourselves. You see, looking for ourselves without a true experience of God is absolutely impossible. It's like trying to make your way out of that cave without a light. At best, you're going to struggle along and bang your knees and maybe fall off a waterfall that you didn't see in front of you, right? I mean, this is the story of life that we see around us. I mean, walk through the checkout line of a grocery store and look at the gossip mags and rags, and what you see the story of people with almost unlimited resources setting out on a search to find themselves. And you see where it ultimately leads. We only get more and more lost. You see, we can't separate the search for self from an encounter with God, because God himself is the source of our self. God is the source of our meaning. Psalm 36, it's one of my favorites. Verse 9 says this, "For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light." God is the light that lets us see light. God is the light that lets us see life. And when we come face to face with God, we begin the journey towards self-understanding. I want to keep going, but instead I'm going to meet up with you next week. And I want to talk about this. The journey towards truly understanding God and yourself starts at the cross. Until then, goodbye, God bless, become a kingdom Christian.